In the first part of this report, we saw why it is so important for us to learn and spread the truth about the Great Hunger. It's a subject that is not well known, even though facts are available. And what do these facts show? First of all, they show that the failure of the potato had long been a fact of Irish life, but the failures were usually only partial, localized, or lasted just one season. Plus, there were other crops on which to rely. The Irish Parliament had countered those lean times by restricting food exports and encouraging additional imports. The Act of Union in 1801, which made Ireland part of Britain, dissolved that Irish Parliament, and Ireland's needs were now administered by the Westminster Parliament, which was made up primarily of landlords. That was the situation in 1845 when the potato failed again, but this time Parliament considered the needs of the landlords rather than the needs of the people, and this time the failure was more than local. It was countrywide. And this time the potato was a much more significant crop than it had ever been before. Yet still it was the only crop that failed. Since a dictionary describes a famine as a general scarcity of food, and since other crops were grown in abundance throughout the land, that would indicate that there never was a famine in Ireland after all. And that's why comparisons to Bangladesh are misleading. That's also why we call it the Great Hunger and not the Great Famine. It's not just semantics. The word famine implies an uncontrollable natural disaster rather than fixing the blame on the real causes. The disaster which befell Ireland only reached its peak in the 1845 to 1850 time frame. It actually started many years earlier, when Irish land was given to trusted Englishmen to establish a loyal population who would hold Ireland for the crown and save the expense of an army of occupation. The subjugation of the native Irish was encouraged to ensure domestic tranquility in a peaceful colony. The new landlords employed the disenfranchised Irish as tenant farmers and even rented them a portion of their former land. The only crop allowed the tenant was that which he could grow on his rented plot of land. His harvest was sold to pay rent to the landlord, taxes to the crown, and a tithe to the Church of England, to which they didn't even belong. What was left he could sell to clothe his family and store to feed them. That's how the stage was set for this great tragedy. That's when the Great Hunger really began. Profit-hungry landlords built a system which fed on greed. Many returned to England and employed agents to run their estates and send the profit over to them. An agent's success was measured by the profit he could turn, and to increase profit, many agents rented a portion of land to middlemen in search of profit themselves. The middlemen subdivided that portion even further and offered it for higher rent. The number of people thus engaged in squeezing profit from the land caused rents to be almost double that for comparable land in England. Few could afford the high rents, so a system of conacre was developed by which a contract was signed for an acre of land, with rent not due until the harvest. Sounded like a good deal, and with no other way to secure land, many were forced into conacre to survive. But like the tenants, their earnings were committed before ever they were attained, and they fell deeper into debt. Another contributing component to the calamity was that Irish married young, believing that children were insurance against poverty and old age, and their priests counseled them that it was the duty of every good Catholic to have as many children as they could. The result was an alarming population explosion, the highest in Europe. In just 60 years, the native population nearly tripled in spite of an incredibly high infant mortality rate of 20%. Further, since land was at a premium, when a tenant's children married, they were forced to share a portion of the parents' land, and each new generation reduced the acreage apportioned to a single family even further. As land became less able to support the growing population and rents, tithes, and taxes rose, the Irish were forced to a crop that could produce the highest yield per acre with the least investment in time, since most of their time was expended working for the landlord. In less than 2 generations, they became totally dependent on that wonderfully nutritious root vegetable, the potato. Even families who had worked the sea for generations were forced to sell their boats and nets when rents, tithes, and taxes left them unable to afford enough salt to preserve a year's catch. Then they too turned to the potato. The stage was set for tragedy, and its coming was no surprise. A terrible blight had hit the potato crop in America in 1843 and in Europe in early 45. It was definitely coming. But in the American and European failures, there was no great suffering and loss of life because there were other crops on which to rely. There were other crops in Ireland too, but they belonged to the landlords. The Irish were even restricted from hunting and fishing, for the rivers, lakes, and woods were the property of the landlords, and hunting was now a crime called poaching, for which a man could be shot.
The potato blight in 1845 came as no surprise, and neither did the impact it would have. The smaller, isolated potato failures, which had occurred in Ireland on previous occasions, had disastrous results, killing thousands by starvation and foretelling the coming tragedy. And Parliament knew this, because since the Act of Union in 1801, no fewer than 114 commissions and 61 special committees had been assigned to study the conditions in Ireland. The consensus was that Ireland was on the verge of starvation, unemployment was rampant, and the standard of living was the lowest in Europe. The Poor Inquiry of 1835 verified that 75% of the Irish were unemployed 30 weeks or a year or more, and unless they could get a patch of land on which to grow potatoes, they would starve. Today, some will say that the Poor Law of 1838, which resulted from these studies, is an example of Crown benevolence. But that poor law was totally inadequate. It was weak, ineffective, and only designed to deal with small numbers.
The Poor Law of 1838 authorized the construction of 130 workhouses capable of sheltering just 1% of the population. Access was restricted to the totally destitute, and conditions for entry were so severe that people only went as a last resort, for upon entry, families were broken up. Mothers were sent to knitting, fathers to road work, and children were sent to industrial apprenticeship. Far from being a humane response to any study, the bill was only enacted to stop the Irish from migrating to England in search of work, as its author attested. Further, the workhouses were to be supported by local taxes collected from the landlords, and as funds ran out, workhouses would be closed. The shocking state of Ireland was studied again in 1842 on the eve of the Calamity by the Devon Commission, who warned that landlords were draining Irish resources, treating Ireland as, quote, little more than a source of income to enhance their lifestyles in England, unquote. But nothing was done to curb their shameful exploitation. Instead, rents, tithes, and taxes increased pressure on the tenant to produce more and more potatoes to survive. With land limited, the growing population was gradually forced to the lumper, a potato which produced a larger yield but offered less in vitamins and minerals. Tragically, the lumper was also the strain of potato most susceptible to the blight that occurred in 1845. There was great apprehension over the possibility of blight hitting Ireland, for everyone knew the consequences would be ghastly. But in spite of all the unmistakable signs, nothing was done to prepare for the impending tragedy. In September of 1845, the fear that many dared not utter was realized. The blight had struck Ireland. It had only been a matter of time, and now that it had arrived, officials knew full well what the consequences would be. In fact, some members of Parliament publicly welcomed it as a solution to Ireland's population explosion. In the next part of our report, we shall discuss the terrible years of blight and hunger that followed.